This is Miss Clark, and we're going to talk about total fertility rate, aka TFR, and some other factors that are going to affect the population growth. This is 3.7 on the College Board's CED, so let's get going. Total fertility rate. As I mentioned, TFR. We're going to be using TFR quite often now. It is the number of children an average woman in a given country will have in their lifetime. So take a woman, she has children during her reproductive years, and how many will she have? We have found that if the TFR of a country is 4, that means that over the course of her reproductive years, again, we're talking like 15 to 44, the average woman in that area or that country will have 4 children. This is an average. So we're going to use it primarily. It's a decimal number. It's not often a whole number because of this. So examples for you. The TFR of Angola, it's about 5.5, where the world average TFR at the moment is 2.5. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, the TFR is going to vary greatly from country to country to country to country. Has to do with social economic status, the location, and so and so. Generally, our poorer developing countries, they're going to have higher TFRs, where our wealthier developed countries are going to have low TFRs. So you can see over here in Niger, it's a very high TFR, where here we are in Korea, extremely low, lower than the world average. Now, we're going to go into some specifics of what this TFR is due to, but primarily it is affected by the age of a woman's first pregnancy, her educational opportunities, that's a big one right there we're going to talk about, general family planning, and then some government policies. I'm sure you've all heard of the one-child policy in China. So there have been government policies that will limit the TFR of a woman. All right, let's talk about some of these characteristics of developing versus developed nations. First of all, when we're talking about TFR, developing is normally greater than 2.1, where developed is less than 2.1 in terms of our TFR. So the developing, we're finding that their economy is based on agriculture, export of raw materials. It's a lot of labor-based. And when it's a lot more labor-based, family planning requires a lot more children to help with that labor. We often have inadequate infrastructure, lack of clean water, limited access to medical care. And that's a big piece because very few children are actually surviving. We talked about that before with the type 3 and the type 2 curves. So when we need to reproduce more because many of our children are not surviving, it's going to increase the TFR, and it's all due to these things such as the limited access to water, lack of clean water, limited access to medical care, and so on. So as I mentioned, we're therefore going to see high birth rate, a high rate of infant mortality, low life expectancy, unfortunately. Not many of these children will live until their reproductive ages. Very little access to education, little access to any contraception options, and unfortunately a very high rate of poverty. All right, now let's talk about the developed. The developed is going to have a TFR that is lower than 2.1, less babies being born. This is often because there's a great economy, and this economy is due to industry or services, and that has created these great infrastructures. And we have all this access to clean water and medical care. So it means as a woman, when I have a child, they're more likely to survive. So we're getting low rates of infant mortality. And because we have those low rates of infant mortality, and because those children can survive, I don't need to have a lot of them. Also, it's not an agricultural-based community, so there's no need for children to help me earn my money and support the family. We also have higher education levels, which we're going to talk about later with women, great access to contraception, and a very low poverty rate. Now, unfortunately, and I kind of touched on this before, the TFR is going to be high in developing countries because of this labor idea. Children are the labor. They're the caregivers to their elderly parents. They're extremely important. So I need to have a lot of them to help support me throughout my entire life. We're also going to have a high rate of infant mortality, lack of access to contraceptives. So sometimes there is no family planning. We're just going with it, and this is what happens, unfortunately. Often, unfortunately, stricter adherence to gender roles. Women are expected to be in the home and providing for the home. Lower levels of education for girls, super important, and then therefore less economic opportunities for women. So their only place is generally at home. On the other hand, our TFR is going to be very low in developed countries because in these developed countries, children are expensive. They're expensive to raise, they're expensive to educate. It's very difficult, so you cannot have many of them. There are social programs for the elderly, so there's no need for children to take care of the elderly. Contraceptives are widely available, and so is abortion. So they're able to make those decisions and spend a lot more time on the family planning. There's a lot more societal restrictions on gender roles, encouraging women to go get their higher education, to learn more, to go to school, and therefore pursue economic opportunities for women. So they're very busy with that. So therefore, sometimes having a child can get in the way. So they don't have as many compared with our less developed countries. All right, now this is the big one. The super important. Education level is a predictor for a woman's TFR. This should be TFR, not TRF here. Massive. They have found that educated women are having fewer children, and she's having them later in life. So this is a fascinating little diagram. All right, now this graph here is showing the percentage of women. So take this decimal of 0.30, let's turn it into a percentage, which would be 30%. And it's the percent of women who have had children at these different ages. And so if we're talking about an illiterate woman, you can see that they're peaking at early 20s. And even then, they're getting pregnant later and later and later as well. So a lot more pregnancies in illiterate women. If we compare that to primary school educated women, very similar trend. Now the trend gets much greater when we look at tertiary. So this would be going to university, getting your bachelor's degree. And you can see how it drastically impacts the percentage of women who are pregnant at these ages. So instead of the mean pregnancy age being about early 20s, it's now closer to 29. So they're having their families later, and even then they're getting pregnant less often along the way. Very important. And again, this is all because of these educational opportunities, which means a woman cannot be at home taking care of all these children. Now, the second thing depends on when women start having their pregnancies. If women wait later in life to have their first child, they're likely to have fewer children. In developed countries like Korea, like Japan, like the United States, many women are not having their first child until they're over 30. And you can see when that happens, we've got a very low TFR. Where we've compared that to having your first child at 19, your TFR is a lot higher. Another great graph here. So you can see that waiting until later in life is going to actually slow down population growth over time. So if they're having their first child around 30, the population growth is going to be a lot slower than if women are having their first child in their teens. So an interesting perspective on how do we slow down this crazy population rate that we see in human populations right now. Fascinatingly, the best way to reduce this population growth is to provide women with education and economic opportunities. It gives them an incentive to wait to have children, to have fewer of those children, and therefore we can actually decrease that population growth. We've seen many countries that have started increasing the women's education and have also noticed a decrease in population. Last thing I want to talk about real fast is infant mortality rate. We need to be aware of what's happening when this number is mentioned. It is the number of children per thousand, very important, per thousand that die before the age of 1. When we talk about child mortality rate, that's the number of children that die before the age of 5. In developing nations, a lot of this mortality happens because of lack of prenatal care for women, low birth rate, malnutrition, infection, diseases, parasitic, and because of clean water, and so on and so. So again, when we have more children dying from infant mortality rate that's high, that's when you're going to see a higher TFR as women are trying to create more children because there's a less likelihood that, unfortunately, those infants will not survive. Another thing we can do, though, if we can somehow reduce this infant mortality, we will see an initial increase in population growth and population rate, but it will drop because women are expecting their children to survive instead of expecting that they will just die through infant mortality rate. Fascinating concept that we're going to dig into a little bit more in class. All right, just a general kind of, so you can see where the child mortality rate in 2017 is still quite high. It is our developing nations, so a lot of Africa, unfortunately. We do have a little bit here in Southeast Asia and as well in the Middle Eastern countries. And again, just another look for you so you can see the child mortality rate. Primarily in Africa, where we have places like Europe, North America, where it's not nearly as bad. All right, thanks so much.